Hi, welcome. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the director of the Skyscraper Museum, and you are rejoining us now for our fall series of authors talks. Tonight, David Freeland, who is going to talk about his book from last spring, American Hotel, the Waldorf-Astoria, and the Making of a Century. This is the first of two talks in 2 weeks that are going to focus on American hotels, indeed New York hotels. And while tonight's talk is about the Waldorf-Astoria in its two iterations on 34th Street and also now on Park Avenue in the Art Deco version, we think of the Waldorf-Astoria embedded in New York history as kind of the New York hotel. It is a hotel of legend. But the subtitle of next week's talk, which I will preview here in my next slide, and I only have 4 slides, that I invite you to come back to listen to and enjoy next Tuesday night at 6 o'clock, is on the Barbizon, another hotel from the kind of Art Deco or the early American modern period in the 1920s. The legendary women's hotel residence that Paulina Bren has written a book about, and she subtitled The Hotel That Set Women Free. So tonight's talk, like next week, are going to focus a little bit on the architecture, but more particularly the social history of the hotel, the use, the legend, the place of celebration and embodiment of New York society that these hotels represented. And David's going to tell us a lot about that. I will just remind people that the Skyscraper Museum has many resources on the early hotels, and especially the earliest of the Waldorf-Astorias, and just to show you a couple of slides to remind you that you can also hear lectures on our website that connect to the hotel by Tom Mellons and AJ Sandoval Strauss on the subjects of 19th century hotels, connected to an exhibition that we did called 10 and Taller. All the buildings in New York that were 10 stories or taller from the first one in 1874 through 1900. And in this map that the museum created, I think you can see in the blue footprints, I'm going to use my cursor to point out the first of the Waldorf-Astoria, the blue footprints are hotels and apartment residences, kind of interchangeable typology in the last quarter of the 19th century. For this exhibition, we mapped the location of these high-rise hotels. And as you can see, they concentrate above 34th Street and up to Central Park, so that at the turn of the 20th century, the concentration of hotels, and these are not all luxury hotels, some of them are residences for middle-class people, some are even working men's kind of dormitories that were 10 stories or taller. But you can see that the high-rise migrated from Wall Street and Lower Manhattan kind of up the trajectory of Broadway to Central Park. But it was the residential high-rise that typified the turn of the century development. And David is going to situate the first Waldorf and Astoria, so the first Waldorf-Astoria on 33rd and 34th Streets in that context, and then take us up to the great Park Avenue mountain of a hotel that represents the Art Deco period in New York so beautifully. I will leave the map there, and I'm going to turn it over to David as soon as I mention his previous books, 2 books on kind of the social history of New York and the entertainment of history, which are long title, a book that he gave a talk at the museum almost a dozen years ago and was published in 2009, called Automats, Taxi Dances, Vaudeville, Excavating Manhattan's Lost Places of Leisure, a very delightful read. and another book, Ladies of Soul. And this background in New York's entertainment history connects to the day job that David has, which is to work as a touring agent for Broadway shows, so that his life is deeply embedded in kind of the showtime of New York and the showiness of the hotels and the social scene that they create and that he'll talk about tonight. He also did Ladies of Soul. Let me just mention that the chat feature is open. I'm going to leave the screen now, and I will be able to monitor questions. So we had a huge, we are expecting a huge turnout tonight, but those people who are actually in the webinar will be able to pose their own questions in chat, and we'll leave about 10 minutes or so at the end of this hour to address some of your queries. So David, let me turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Carol, for here we are, for the introduction, and thanks to you and to Jean and Sebastian and to the wonderful Skyscraper Museum for having me here this evening. I'm really delighted to be here. And as Carol mentioned, my book does cover both Waldorf-Astorias, the first one on 33rd, 34th Street and 5th Avenue, and then the one we know of today on Park Avenue and 50th. So I'm going to spend the first part of the lecture talking a little bit about the first Waldorf, and then we'll move into the second. So when we're talking about the Waldorf-Astoria, you'll hear a lot about the feuding cousins who together were responsible for building the hotel. And one of these cousins was William Waldorf-Astor, who was John Jacob Astor's great-grandson, and reputedly for a while the richest person in the United States. Now, William Waldorf grew up in part in his family's mansion on 33rd Street and 5th Avenue, in what was at the time a quiet and rather elegant residential part of the city. So when his father, John Jacob Astor III, died in 1890, William Waldorf, known as Willie to his family, moved ahead with some long-standing plans to develop the property that his house had been on, and the Hotel Waldorf was the result. So construction of the Hotel Waldorf took place all throughout 1891 and 1892. And no doubt it created an enormous annoyance for his aunt, Caroline Astor, who was the Mrs. Astor of Mrs. Astor's 400 fame. And her house was right next door. As a matter of fact, you can see the south wall of it right here. That was her mansion, and it was separated from the Waldorf site by nothing more than a garden. So out of pique, and kind of in the case of one-upmanship, the legend goes, her son, John Jacob IV, who was William Waldorf's cousin, decided to develop the site of his family's house into a hotel too. And as a result, we had the Astoria, which opened 4 years after the Waldorf in 1897. So there are a lot of exaggerations to the story, but one of the things worth pointing out is that the two hotels pretty much operated as a single hotel from the very beginning. They were never really separate or in competition with one another. Also, as for the relationship between the feuding cousins, I think a story that probably best represents more of the day-to-day nature of their relationship is when an observer was sitting in a cafe nearby and was having his breakfast and happened to notice William Waldorf walk in, go inside and move to one corner of the cafe, sit down and take out a book, he was rather bookish, and have his coffee and breakfast and read it. Then about a few moments later, his cousin, John Jacob, walked in, went to a whole other corner of the cafe, had his breakfast, took out a newspaper and read. And the two cousins, passed the entire breakfast in the same cafe, but it appeared as if neither one was aware of the other's presence. So I think that story kind of represents the day-to-day relationship, one of coolness probably bordering on indifference. So if we can go back to the Hotel Waldorf for just a moment, something to point out was the significance of its architecture. That's something that has characterized the Waldorf-Astoria from the very beginning. The designer, the architect for the Hotel Waldorf was Henry Hardenberg. Many of you probably know him from the Dakota, his earlier Dakota, and then his later Plaza. But he modeled the Hotel Waldorf after Heidelberg Castle in Germany. So it was a mixture of Chateauesque and German Renaissance. And what's interesting about this photograph is this is from about 1893. And if you can see here on the left, the main entrance is actually on 33rd Street. It's not on Fifth Avenue. The entrance is right here where the canopies are. And the reason for that is initially, the manager who ran the Hotel Waldorf, as an aside, William Waldorf-Astor himself didn't really have a whole lot to do with the hotel once it was open. As a matter of fact, we know of only one time that he actually visited the hotel in person. But the manager was a man named George Bolt, and George Bolt wanted to create the Hotel Waldorf as a really exclusive enclave. He really wanted to have the Vanderbilts and so on patronize the hotel. So it was believed at the time that even though Fifth Avenue was very quiet, even so, Fifth Avenue was still a little bit too bumptious for the clientele that George Bolt wished to cultivate. So he had the main entrance over to the side on 33rd Street to sort of preserve that air of privacy. And if you were to walk in from the 33rd Street entrance right here, and you walk all the way back, one of the first things you would see was the Palm Garden. The Palm Garden was just a lovely space, and it became one of New York's most elegant dining spots in the 1890s. And the dome was of tessellated glass. And as you can see, it was a very verdant space. And in the afternoon, you can imagine with the sun streaming through all of the glass above, it created just a truly lovely and enchanting environment. So one of the things, as Carol said, my book really does focus on the social history of this building and of the Waldorf-Astoria as an institution. So much of my book is about the way in which the Waldorf interacted with the city as part of the city. Truly, the Waldorf was not just in New York, but it was of New York. And so from very early on, we see how the Waldorf, in spite of its kind of elite reputation, was a part of the larger city, which was at the time in the 1890s, growing increasingly diverse with immigration and more people coming to the city from around the world. And I think this photograph is very interesting. It's of some people probably maybe on a Sunday afternoon promenading up Fifth Avenue. And as you can see on the left, we have a flower cellar, and there's another one over here on the right. Evidently, it was a thing, you know, for gentlemen strolling up Fifth Avenue with lady friends to buy them flowers. But something else I think is fascinating about this photograph, and I didn't even realize it until I had licensed it for the book and blew it up, is that right in the very center, we have a very well-dressed African-American gentleman walking down Fifth Avenue too. So it just gives you an idea. The Waldorf, we might think of it as a rather elite, even perhaps predominantly white place. But the truth was, the Waldorf survived and thrived, I would say, by opening its doors to a wide range of the city. In that way, it reflected the city. And this became even more of a thing when the Astoria portion of the hotel opened in 1897. Henry Hardenberg came back to design this. And just to give you an idea of how much larger the hotel became once the Astoria opened, is that the original Waldorf portion of the hotel is just this section here you see on the left. So the hotel more than doubled in size. And from this point going forward, it managed to preserve the reputation for being elite and luxurious, but the reality was it serviced a wider range of people, because the truth is you can't have like 1,400 rooms and keep it that exclusive. George Bolt, who was still the manager, had to lower the bars to some extent. Here's a map of the ground floor, and here again you can see that the original Waldorf portion is just this upper left rectangle. So there are a lot of myths you'll hear about the Waldorf-Astoria. One has to do with Peacock Alley. Many of you may have heard of that. And often it's said that Peacock Alley was a corridor running in between the Waldorf and the Astoria. That's actually not true. You can see here that essentially the original Waldorf was kind of nestled into the Astoria that surrounded it. So there was never really any hallway that could have been seen as connecting the two. Generally, Peacock Alley was considered to be this corridor here, this long corridor running along the 34th Street end of the building. And here's a view of it from about 1900. And what's interesting about this is, well, a couple of things I should mention. Interestingly, the hotel never, during this period anyway, did not use this name Peacock Alley to promote itself. Peacock Alley was a facetious term that some newspaper reporters gave to the space because it was a place where people were strutting like peacocks to see and be seen. At this time in the 1890s, alleys were considered very lowly places. And there's no way that a hotel like the Waldorf-Astoria, trying to preserve its reputation, which was very important, would ever use a term that had any whiff of something low about it. Actually, the term Peacock Alley generally, I believe, was not used by the hotel until around the 1920s, when it was trying to build upon its nostalgia for its past. But here again, it was a place to see and be seen. And whoever did this drawing was very, very clever, because over here on the left, we can see a rather interesting scene. It almost gets buried in it, in the whole scene. But you can see a man up against the wall here with a young woman in front of him. And they're kind of having their own tete-a-tete, but she is in the midst of turning around and almost like flirting with a gentleman who's walking past. And it's a very curious little detail. But the truth was that the Waldorf-Astoria, always had to guard against what was outside. Hotels really they're privately owned, but they function as public space. And that is one of the qualities that always characterized the Waldorf from the very beginning. Everyone went there, and the Waldorf as an institution allowed people really to just come in, sit down. You didn't have to be staying at the Waldorf as a guest. Many people were just what they called lobby sitters or seat warmers, who would just come in, sit in the hotel lobby, just because it was a fun thing to do, and it was enjoyable to watch the people pass. But the Waldorf, the first Waldorf, was situated on the edge of the Tenderloin, which was the great late 19th century vice district. Really, it was the area that grew up to the west of the luxurious hotels of Fifth Avenue and Broadway. And it was a place of expensive vice, place of dance halls and gambling parlors and houses, brothels. So prostitution was always kind of around the hotel. So the hotel worked assiduously using its own team of in-house detectives, plainclothes detectives, to root out all forms of immorality, but particularly prostitution, and also, as it happened, unmarried couples sharing a room. And this is just one example of this. For many, many years, reporters wondered what might lie within the contents of a very secret black book, a detective's log that was kept by the Waldorf-Astoria and allowed to be seen only by a very few senior staff members. Thankfully, when the original Waldorf was torn down in 1929, some very, very helpful person was digging through the dumpster, found this document, found this log, and took it to the New York Public Library. So we have it preserved. But a lot of the entries here are rather mundane, related to stolen jewelry and coats and the like. But the one on top does relate to an unmarried couple who were burst in upon by the chief house detective and told to leave. They were essentially burst in upon right in the middle of the act. And that happened pretty frequently. And that was what was necessary, the hotel believed, that it had to do to preserve its reputation. It never wanted to be thought of as supporting anything immoral. And by the way, these were not everyday people. Both of the people who were ejected that are on the top entry here were members of the social register and represented the upper elite of New York society. So the head detective said at one point, we don't have any friends and we don't do anyone any favors. And they certainly did not. There was a flip side to this, however, because as vigilant as the hotel detectives were in rooting out immorality, that degree of vigilance gave the managers of the Waldorf a kind of security in pushing forward in other areas where it could be a social leader. And this is kind of a dichotomy. It's probably too much for me to unpack here in this lecture, but I do get into it quite in a detailed way in chapter 2 of the book. But one of the fascinating things is that the Waldorf was one of the first places where women could go in the evening after a certain hour and be admitted to cafes and restaurants without being accompanied by a man. At the time, it was very common for the better class of restaurants to prohibit women who were unescorted without male accompaniment after a certain hour. So the Waldorf was the first of its class to publicly state exactly what you see here. Ladies without escort will be served in the restaurants hereafter at any hour. And what was so significant about the Waldorf is because it was always a leader within the hotel industry. So whenever the Waldorf did something, that kind of created a signal for others to follow, so other hotels to follow. So when the Waldorf did this, after 1907, we can trace the slow erosion, the gradual erosion of the escort rule. So it's just one of the ways that the Waldorf, in terms of its policy, made an active difference in the life of our city. So I mentioned the Tenderloin a second ago. After about 1910, beginning in the teens, the Tenderloin started to erode. And there are a lot of reasons behind this, but basically the Tenderloin mostly disappeared by the teens, and by the 20s, it was long gone. So the good news is prostitution was no longer right outside of the doorway. But it actually wasn't such good news because along with the Tenderloin went the theater district, went the entertainment district. All of that moved up to Times Square, what we now, after 1904, Times Square. So by the 1920s, the Waldorf was increasingly isolated. It was boxy, it was really big, and it was no longer profitable. So at the end of 1928, it was announced that the Waldorf would be closing. And this photograph, I think, is just delightful because here we have demolition workers who basically are kind of poking gentle fun at the building, the history of the building that they've been hired to destroy. So while this didn't get out in the press for a little while, but the truth was that the Waldorf-Astoria had been looking for a new location for some time. I should back up. I think most of us know what rose on the site of the old Waldorf-Astoria, but just in case, I'll say the Empire State Building. So looking to this slide, the Waldorf had been looking for a site for some time, and it was tricky to find because by the 1920s, it was very difficult to find large parcels of undeveloped land in Manhattan. The 20s were one of the biggest building spurts Manhattan had seen. Truly, it may be unrivaled in the history of the city. So fortunately, the New York Central Railroad had an enormous plot of property extending north of Grand Central Station in what had been a train yard, a giant train yard, which had been one of the largest train yards in the Western Hemisphere. There were exposed tracks stretching all the way up from the top of Grand Central Terminal to 50th Street. And basically, when steam trains began to be replaced with electric trains, that development allowed all of those tracks to be sunk underground. So an engineer who worked for the New York Central came up with this marvelous idea to build over the tracks, to hold on to the ownership of the land, but to lease the property out to new holders. And it was a great arrangement because the New York Central could control to some degree what was built on the property. And suddenly all of these ready-made parcels were available, which was a great thing in the 1920s. So this was the site that the Waldorf chose. The only problem was it had actually already been built upon. This is from probably the early to mid-teens. And there was a YMCA building that had already been built. Getting rid of that was no big deal. But getting rid of this power plant here was quite an undertaking. So here's a scene of it in 1930. And you can see the train tracks running below. Basically, these buildings didn't have basements per se. Massive steel columns would be dug and buried in the bedrock of Manhattan and built over the train tracks. So they would bestride the train tracks all while the trains below were running up and down. And it was really a rush job and a big job. One of the hardest things related to the dismantling of this power plant was and to give you one example, was to take apart 8 massive rotary converters. Each one was 10 feet tall in a metal base of several tons. Those had to be taken apart piece by piece, lifted, and then lowered by pulleys down to the tracks here below, and then hauled 7 blocks south to 43rd Street, where they would be installed in the basement of a new building. And all of this had to happen while trains were running below. So it's rather horrifying today to think of it, but any little slip and a 3,000-pound shaft could have gone crashing down onto trains and passengers. So here we have a scene that is very interesting. One of the things that is very true, and I like to emphasize about the transition from the old Waldorf to the new, is that the new one would not have been possible without the old one coming before it. It was the old one's reputation that allowed the new one to be built with such support. And the board of directors in charge of building the new Waldorf really sought to assure the public that this was more than just a case of a new building kind of slapping an old name onto it and conferring legitimacy in that way. The Waldorf really went out of its way to bring back all the people from the original one, even like the head housekeeper. But for example, here we have Oscar Czerki, known as Oscar of the Waldorf. He was probably the most famous figure of the early Waldorf. I would call him kind of like a celebrity chef of the 1890s. He actually didn't cook, but he became the Waldorf kind of mascot. So the Waldorf was so skillful at publicity and PR. As a matter of fact, it was one of the first hotels, I believe, that I can tell, to hire an outside PR agency. They knew that Oscar, who didn't really do a whole lot by this point, but by the 30s, he was a great nostalgia symbol. The man next to him is Lucius Boomer, who I'll talk about in a moment. He had been the manager of the first Waldorf in the teens and 20s. And he's probably the most important figure in the history of the Waldorf-Astoria. He became the president of the board of the new Waldorf, and he was the one who really shepherded the move from Fifth Avenue to Park Avenue. And then to his right is Charles Hayden, who was a financier, best known today for Hayden Planetarium, who was also on the board of the new Waldorf-Astoria. And then the man to the right is Augustus Null, who was another old timer who had been George Bolt's private secretary. And the writing here on this kind of fancy script is Oscar's. Significantly, what they're doing here is driving the first rivet into the building. So in skyscraper construction, a rivet is what takes a connection that has been sealed temporarily with bolts and makes it permanent. So there's a symbolism here coming at the time that it did at the beginning of the Depression, when things were looking very, very bleak for the country at large and for the building industry and for employment, all of it. Focusing on the symbolism of the rivet as something that makes things permanent. And that was significant. And in addition, as the press pointed out in this photo, the rivet was gold plated. So here we have one of the most famous photographs, and I would say in the Waldorf-Astoria history, certainly the one that's probably the most widely reproduced. It's kind of hard to believe, isn't it, that this is only less than 1 year after that other photograph I showed you, where the men were dressing up in Edwardian attire, demolishing the building. Here we have the same kind of thing, another publicity stunt, where we have the construction workers dressed up as waiters, enjoying Waldorf's famed cuisine on a girder high above Manhattan. Now, these construction workers were dubbed Skyboys by the press because they managed to erect these buildings walking on girders that were just inches wide, terrifying in many ways. Many of them came from seafaring backgrounds. They had worked in the masts of ships. Some of them were from Newfoundland, which is actually where my family is from. So I feel something of a connection to them. But we can see here how, if you look very closely at this image, one of them is looking out at the city, and he's looking out at all the other buildings that the Waldorf already is towering above. And another thing that's worth pointing out in this photograph is the Thompson Starrett Company. The Thompson Starrett Company built the Waldorf and a lot of other skyscrapers of the time. As a matter of fact, for a while they had a promotional brochure that had the tagline, New York's skyline is our byline. So interestingly enough, early renderings of the Waldorf-Astoria were much more in a kind of neo-Gothic style associated with the late 1920s. The architects for the Waldorf-Astoria was the firm of Schultz and Weaver, and the chief designer was a man named Lloyd Morgan. They had done a lot of hotels. I think the most recent one, or one of the most recent ones at that time, was the Sherry Netherland, which was a residence hotel. I'm sure most of you know it today, but they also designed hotels in Miami and Los Angeles, the Biltmore in Coral Gables. But the first rendering, if you can see here, it's hard to see a little bit, but it features neo-Gothic finials and elements much more associated with the late 1920s. But getting back to Lucius Boomer, he really was a very interesting person. He grew up in he had a very unusual background. He grew up in a religious cult. based in Florida called the Koreans. There was a very interesting book written about them a few years ago by a historian named Lynn Milner. But it was kind of a messianic cult, but it was also very progressive on the surface. There were only about 200 of them at its peak. But he was something of a visionary, and he really wanted the Waldorf-Astoria to be, in his words, modern without being modernistic. So in other words, he wanted it to be up to date, to be modern, but he didn't want it to be cold and austere. So the result was, by the time 1931 rolled around and the Waldorf opened, this is what we had. It had become in the style, finished in the style that we now call Art Deco. And the brick was made specifically for this project from Pennsylvania, a quarry, and it was known as Waldorf Gray. And perhaps probably the most typical features of the new building were the lanterns on top. This was incidentally the very last hotel designed by the firm of Schultz and Weaver, which is kind of interesting in itself. But the truth is, Manhattan had seen such building in the 1920s. There was such an oversupply of hotels by the time the Depression hit that it took like 30 years for Manhattan to build another hotel of more than 1,000 rooms. So this would be the last one built of this size for like almost another 30 years. So here's a cross section of the hotel that I actually took from something that was hanging in the Waldorf lobby the last week it was open. And what I really wanted to show you is just the idea that this was a city within the city. I don't know if you could say honestly that the Waldorf pioneered the concept of hotels as cities within cities, but I certainly think you could argue that in the Waldorf, that idea reached its apotheosis, because we have here really a world where you can just spend all day going from the barbershop to the bank, to the shops, to the cafes, up and down the elevators, and never really leave the realm of the hotel. An astute architectural critic once wrote that the Waldorf was not where you went to escape the city, but where you went to feel it throbbing through your veins. It was truly of the city. And this idea of being an extension of the city streets actually was played out in the arrangement of rooms and the design. Walking in from Park Avenue, from the left right here, this is what you would see. You'd see the Park Avenue lobby, which is truly an elegant space, now landmarked. I'll get back to that later. But we have just delightful murals up above, and this beautiful mural at the bottom by a French artist, Louis Regal. Here's a close-up of it. It's called The Wheel of Life, and it's meant to represent a life in all of its stages from birth to death. The tour guide who first showed it to me said, yeah, it's kind of like a hotel, because now we're kind of nearing the end of our life too. It was when the Waldorf was closing. And from there, you could walk up the steps and you move right into the main lobby. So really, the Waldorf is sequenced on its ground floor as a succession of spaces, and each one has its own identity. And it's very special because great architecture is like great art. It's something that we can all admire from a distance, but how much more powerful architecture is when we can be within it and use it. Architecture is meant to be used by definition. And so I always feel that architecture has so much more potency that we can feel when we actually walk through it, move through it. That's why context is so important. This is just another detail that I took of the ceiling, the lovely decoration on the ceiling. And one of the most marvelous, I think, features of the Waldorf-Astoria is also on the ground level, is the use of nickeled bronze throughout. You look at the Waldorf-Astoria and you can really see the fineness of materials that were used throughout the building. And this detail is especially lovely because here we have these willowy classical figures, but the designer, the same person who did that tile work on the floor, created it so that the two figures separate whenever the doors open, and then they close up again when the doors close. So it's just a lovely touch, and also thankfully is now preserved by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Also, we see wonderful materials throughout the Waldorf, like the use of burled walnut. This is actually the new Peacock Alley. As I mentioned or alluded to before, by the time the new Waldorf-Astoria opened, its directors no longer shied away from the term Peacock Alley. And that was just one of the ways I think the Waldorf was able to use its reputation to preserve sort of this, this lustrous past. And it did it very, very successfully. The truth was, I know we think of the Waldorf as being a very exclusive, very elegant place, and it was elegant, certainly. But the new Waldorf also had, by one count, about 2,000 rooms. So the reality was the managers of the Waldorf, especially in 1931, had to offer rooms at a range of price points. If we're talking about a basic room, a run-of-house room, it would have cost in 1931, all throughout the 30s, about $6. And that's probably about $110, $120 today. So it's not, you know, hugely expensive. But sometimes the Waldorf's reputation for elegance actually, in a way, hurt it because people thought it was maybe more unapproachable than it really was. But the truth was, people from all walks of life went there, stayed there, ate in the restaurants, went into the lobbies. This is one of, I think, the most remarkable spaces in the Waldorf. It's on the 3rd floor outside of the ballroom. It's called the Silver Gallery. And if you approach it, no other space, probably in 1931, would have seemed so modern. Because when you're walking down and you're opening one of the doors here on the left, you can see yourself reflected in a multiplicity of glass panels. It's just like a fun house, and it's so sleekly elegant. But if you look very closely up above, you'll see 2 rows of Impressionist paintings. And these are actually remnants of the original Waldorf that were brought from the original Waldorf and reinstalled. So look how clever the designers were. You know, they had been trying to find a way to implement Lucius Boomer's mandate of looking to the future while honoring the history of the old hotel. So this is what they did. They put the representative of the old hotel into the most modern space in the hotel. And that was how they visually interpreted Boomer's mandate. And I think it's just a truly clever and a fascinating way of doing it. Entertainment had always been a part of the Waldorf history from the very beginning, but really in the new hotel, you could say that the Waldorf-Astoria became a leader in entertainment. And one of the rooms that became probably one of the most chic night spots in Manhattan was the Empire Room. And this is what it looks like, what it looked like in February of 2017, just a beautiful space. Many of the greats played here: Lena Horne, Mel Torme, even later on, people like Sonny and Cher, Diana Ross. It was Frank Sinatra, truly a great New York entertainment space. Here's another view of it. And then the ballroom itself, which is on the 3rd floor, this was quite a feat of engineering, because this is in the center of the hotel. So basically, the construction of this created a giant hole in the middle of the hotel. And this, believe it or not, has to support the weight of all the floors above. So to do that, the builders created a massive system of trusses on top of this space. And watching, it was quite something to see as it was being put into place. In 1930, crowds of curious people would gather on the sidewalk to look, because there were like 6 trusses, and then on top of them was what's called a top cord. And that in and of itself, it was about 1/3 the length of a north-south city block. So when all of that was in place, basically all the weight of the 40-something stories above got diverted over to the sides of the ballroom, and that's how the weight was supported. Interestingly, the Waldorf for a while was the tallest hotel in the world. It wasn't until like the 1950s that that a hotel in Moscow was built that was taller. Interestingly, because it was so significant for a building like this to be opened in 1931, quite a lot of attention was paid to the opening of the Waldorf-Astoria. And as a matter of fact, it was inaugurated by President Hoover, now speaking in an address from Washington. But today it's kind of, you would think, it's kind of unusual for a sitting US president to formally inaugurate the opening of a private structure. But you have to look at what this symbolized again for the time. And I'm going to just quote just a couple lines from his speech, which was about 90 years ago, a little over 90 years ago in a month. What he said, what Hoover said was, "The erection of this great structure at this time has been a contribution to the maintenance of employment and is an exhibition of courage and confidence to the whole nation." So he was really trying to reassure the public that what was becoming known as the Depression was temporary. So he really wanted to show that the worst was behind us. Our hotels have become community institutions. They are the center points of civic hospitality. They are the meeting place of 1,000 community and national activities. They have come to be conducted in far larger vision than mere profit earning. So it's important to understand that hotel keepers of the 20th century very much saw themselves as social leaders, as having a kind of civic responsibility through opening doors and showing hospitality to a diverse range of people. I think that's something we've kind of moved away from now, but it's really important to remember that throughout much of the 20th century, hotels were so much more than places to lay one's head. And the Waldorf really embodied that. Lucius Boomer and everyone associated with the Waldorf saw themselves as having a civic responsibility. This redounded also to entertainment. One of the first things that Lucius Boomer did was start booking more youthful acts, I guess you could say, at the Waldorf. And he booked Benny Goodman in 1938 and 1939. At the time, we don't think of this today, but Benny Goodman represented young person's music. So it was quite an unusual booking for a hotel like the Waldorf. One of the first people I interviewed was his lead singer in 1939, who performed at the Waldorf. Her name is Louise Tobin. She's now 103. She was just so surprised that people came to the Waldorf to watch a swing band. It was just such a surprise, but they did. Socially, significantly, Benny Goodman's band was integrated. Here we have the great Lionel Hampton on vibes. So that kind of, again, sent a message to the industry, which was extremely segregated at the time. It was very hard for people of color to get bookings in hotels. And this is one of the things that started to make a change through specific policies that the Waldorf instituted. Again, in 1955, the Empire Room had its first headliner of color, Dorothy Dandridge. This was a long time in coming, but here again, it signaled to the Empire Room's competitors, like the Persian Room at the Hotel Plaza, for example, that, okay, we can start booking people of color too. So you started to see more performers of color headlining these big, these luxurious rooms, like the Empire Room. Also, socially, and it's very important to emphasize, I think the Waldorf had always been extremely prominent, but its visibility rose to a new level with the coming of the United Nations in 1946. That all happened so quickly. New York, quote unquote, got the UN very quickly. And really, New York was in a way not ready for the level of responsibility thrust upon it right after the war ended. Suddenly, New York found itself as an international city that had to host international delegates. And there was a real space problem, partially, that was part of it, but also where to put them and what to do with delegates of color coming from around the world. At the time in New York, say nothing of the rest of the country, there was certainly in New York a de facto form of segregation, racial segregation operating in hotels. Usually the worst offenders were not like the Waldorf, but the ones like just one level down that maybe had more to lose, like say the Algonquin. So very early, the UN Secretariat had been concerned about the problem of discrimination, met with Lucius Boomer and said, okay, here's what we're going to do. If you agree to house all of our delegates, regardless of color, and not discriminate, we'll favor you with all of our events. You'll be kind of like the adjunct facility to the UN, and that's what happened. So that's really how the Waldorf rose to, I would say, a level of international prestige. There was a post-war treaty actually negotiated in the hotel in Lucius Boomer's apartment, which he gave up for something called the Council of Foreign Ministers. It was the last meeting that the four main allied powers had to basically decide what to do with the defeated Axis powers. So the future of Trieste, for example, was determined inside of the Waldorf-Astoria. That just gives you an idea of the level of prominence that it had at one time. And here we have a photograph that I love, because to me, it encapsulates the level, the degree of prominence that the Waldorf had on the international stage, as represented by a civil rights leader who had just come back from receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in Europe, in Norway, of course, Martin Luther King, and then Coretta Scott King. Then we have sitting Vice President Humphrey in the middle here. Clearly someone has just said something funny, and we get to see Dr. King in a more lighthearted way, which I think is really nice to see. Then we have the local, as represented by Mayor Wagner. I don't know who this gentleman is to the far right. So we have here a synthesis of international, national, and local, and that was really the relationship that prevailed at the Waldorf-Astoria and what made it special. When I say sometimes that it's hard to imagine another hotel having this level of prominence, again, that's what I mean. Really, it was a place where so many developments related to American history were played out to a certain extent. Even President Nixon Nixon accepted the presidency from the Grand Ballroom of the Waldorf-Astoria. So all of those photographs that you see of him holding his fingers in the air like that were taken at the Waldorf-Astoria. He basically had been living in New York. He moved into the Waldorf during the election, and the early morning after he won, that's where he made his speech. Speaking of presidents, the Waldorf Towers really in many ways operated distinctly from the Waldorf-Astoria as a hotel. For one thing, when they were built, they were intended for longer term occupancy. They were not intended for transient occupancy. And actually, if you had a suite or an apartment in the Waldorf Towers, you didn't have to go through the lobby of the Waldorf. You could if you wanted to, but you could also enter from a separate entrance on 50th Street. So for that reason, my book centers much more on the Waldorf as public space. So I don't focus as much on the Waldorf Towers, but interestingly, this last week where I stayed there, just before it closed, I took a tour, and I guess they just kind of figured at this point, why not? Let's just show them everything. So they took us up to the presidential suite. This was where all the presidents from Hoover all the way through Obama stayed. So it was great fun, you know, to be able to see this space that wasn't open to the public very often. The tradition was that each president would leave something behind. So JFK left his rocking chair. You know, he had a bad back. I think, let's see, Eisenhower either left this globe or the clock. This is MacArthur's writing desk. He wasn't a president, but he left that behind. So that's the history that we got to see. And then also I always feel silly, a little silly sharing this photo because I look silly, but my partner and I got to see the bathrooms in the Waldorf Towers. And one critic once wrote that they were some of the greatest 1930s bathrooms in all of New York. And to be able to see that was also just a tremendous treat. So a lot of you are going to be thinking what's going on now and what's happening with the Waldorf today. So the last day of the Waldorf-Astoria was February 28th, 2017. Since then, it's been undergoing a process of conversion into what will be a combination of condos and hotel rooms. The company that initially purchased the hotel was called Anbang, and a Chinese company. It's been reorganized a number of times, but anyway, the plan for the moment is to have the entire hotel reopened by 2023, and this is a rendering of what the main lobby is going to look like. You have the clock in the middle. This is another remnant of the original Waldorf-Astoria that's been preserved. Was on display recently at the New York Historical Society. Has been restored. Going to occupy a place in the center of the main lobby again, along with Cole Porter's piano. Cole Porter was a resident of the Waldorf Towers. And what I want to share with you is that the very last week it was open, the Landmarks Preservation Commission was able to get inside the building and voted unanimously to landmark much of the interior. A lot of what I've been showing you, everything pretty much on the ground floor and most of what's on the third floor, the grand ballroom, the silver corridor that I was showing you. Interestingly, the hotel had been landmarked back in 1993, but that landmarking only covered the exterior. You know, a lot of buildings in New York are landmarked on the exterior, but getting something landmarked inside is a much tougher thing. So thankfully, what we really love the most about the Waldorf, which are the interior spaces, will be preserved. And here we have a rendering of what they expect the hotel to look like once it's opened. Everything is cleaned, the facade is cleaned, and we have the restored lanterns on top, which certainly are probably the most prominent feature of the hotel if you're looking at it from the New York skyline. So I want to thank all of you for sharing this with me and for being such a great group of people to talk to. So if any of you have any questions, we can get into that now.
Thank you, David. I hope that I don't see myself on the screen, but I hope that other people do now.
Should I stop sharing my screen, Carol, or no? I guess
yes, actually.
I should stop. Okay, I'll stop.
Yeah.
Okay, there.
Okay, great. Here we are. So we're just about at 7 o'clock. I have some questions, and there been just a comment posted in the chat from Barbara, who says, I was lucky enough to stay in a suite that had a grand piano in it. I never wanted to leave that room. And this reminds me and predicts some of the comments of Paulina Bren in her book on the Barbizon about so many people who stayed there and whose lives were, really affected by that experience. And you mentioned in your talk that interviews was one of the aspects of your research. And I know Paulina did very, very many interviews in her methodology of trying to bring the stories of women's lives and the kind of demographic of people that would stay at the Waldorf. So if you could talk a little bit about your research method, and while I wait, and we maybe take another 5 minutes or so for people to enter questions in the chat box, and I can monitor those. But I'm sure you could talk for a very long time, David, about your research methods, but give us a little clue about how you proceeded.
Sure, it was a lot. Fortunately, there were so many documents generated related to the Waldorf-Astoria not kept necessarily at the Waldorf's own archive or not kept by the hotel, but for every piece of correspondence, there are always two people. And on the receiving end, fortunately, there's just a tremendous variety of primary sources, letters, documents, very interesting, preserved throughout the country. So my research took me everywhere from Ithaca, where there's a tremendous hotel archive, to the University of Houston, where there are the Hilton archives. The hotel was owned by the Conrad Hilton for a while. To the state archives of Florida. The Wisconsin Historical Society has tremendous holdings related to social history, and I found each chapter in my book kind of connects to a larger social movement and illustrates the way that the Waldorf, how that movement in part played out within the Waldorf walls. And so I found great material. Also, the State Department archives, those were quite a challenge to wade through. I found someone who used to work there and helped me find what I needed. So all over, and then interviews, finding key people like Tom Margatai, who unfortunately passed away about a couple months after I interviewed him, but he worked at the hotel in 1950, its peak years, and he was very kind and really illuminated the experience of working there. Worked for a very difficult guy there, kind of difficult to work for, influential but difficult, named Claude Philippe. Tom Margatai later went on to run the Four Seasons restaurant. So those were the kinds of figures I saw, people, former managers, people who could illuminate how the Waldorf viewed itself and its role within the city.
And could you talk a little bit more about how then you organized that massive amount of material in so many different themes?
Well, before I start writing any chapter, I outline it in a detailed way, because I want to make sure that it works structurally and that I've got all the material that I need to support what I want to do. So I kind of know where I need to end up, and then I arrange everything to support that. And then if I don't have enough material, just like I might know something, but then I need, as an historian, I know it, but I need to have the documents to back it up, to prove it. I need those primary source documents. So as I do the outline for each chapter, which can go on for like 5 pages or more, those little areas where I need more research, where I need to dig more, those become very, very apparent. So that meant just going back and digging some more, finding more archives, finding somebody else, digging further. So only when I knew I had everything I needed, all my questions answered, then I would start writing the chapter. So writing each chapter, probably that's the fastest part of it, because by that point I know exactly what I want to do, where I need to go, where I need to wind up, and how that chapter is then going to lead into the next.
And so how much did you enjoy writing this book?
Love it. Well, I just love writing of any kind. So I love researching, I love writing. It's just it's a joyous process for me, even though there's a lot of pressure because of deadlines and so forth. It's also a joyous process.
Mm-hmm. Well, all I see, someone just has posed a question: in what way did management policies that were implemented at the Waldorf influence the workplace today?
Well, I think certainly in terms of the workplace today and management policies, it's a lot. So much of the way hotels are run now, you could probably look to the way the Waldorf was run. The man I was talking about, Lucius Boomer, implemented a lot of policies that are still used today. He wrote a book on hotel management that really became a primer in the field and was used by many generations of employees, of students in hotel management programs.
Well, everything else that I see in the chat is just profuse thank yous to you and, and praise of fantastic talks. So as we're a little bit after our time, I think that we just add to the applause for the evening. And thank you, David, for taking on this history of two New York icons and really expanding our understanding, certainly for architectural historians, of the social history of the life of the building as well as the life of the city. So thanks so much for this evening, and everybody come back next week when we focus on women's social history as played out in the arena and stage of the Barbizon, with Paulina Brin and also with a dialogue of Andrea Barnett, a writer who has focused on a book that she wrote called Visionary Women that takes a kind of biographical approach to the importance of women's history in the second half of the 20th century. So it's Hotel 2 weeks here at the Skyscraper Museum. And David, we hope we'll see you back next time too.
See you with the next book. Thank you, Carol. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everybody. Take care and good night.